Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 7 years on the force in suburban Connecticut, and I thought I'd seen every type of domestic call you could imagine. It was a humid Tuesday evening in late September when dispatch sent me and my partner, Officer Janet Crowley, to a residential property on Willowbrook Avenue. The caller, a neighbor, reported hearing a woman screaming repeatedly from the house next door. I remember finishing my lukewarm coffee and tossing the paper cup in the cruiser's floor as we pulled up to the address, a weathered two-story colonial with peeling white paint and overgrown hedges that seemed to swallow the front porch. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting these long, twisted shadows across the lawn, and I could hear dogs barking somewhere in the distance. The whole neighborhood had that quiet, heavy feeling you get right before a thunderstorm, where even the air seems to be holding its breath. The woman was standing in the driveway when we arrived, wearing a floral nightgown that looked like it belonged to someone's grandmother, with these tiny yellow roses all over it. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and her feet were bare on the gravel, which must have hurt like hell, but she didn't seem to notice. What struck me immediately was how she kept touching her chest, right over her heart, with both hands pressed flat against the fabric. "He shot me," she said, looking straight at me with these wide, glassy eyes. "He shot me right here." Janet approached her slowly while I scanned the windows of the house, checking for any movement inside. The woman appeared to be in her mid-30s. No visible injuries, no blood on her nightgown. But she kept repeating those same 3 words like they were the only ones she remembered how to say. When Janet asked her name, she just stared through us like we weren't even there and whispered it again. "He shot me." We tried everything to get through to her, asking about her partner, if anyone else was in the house, if she needed medical attention. But she just kept pressing her hands to her chest and swaying slightly, like she was hearing music nobody else could hear. Janet radioed for backup while I approached the front door, which was slightly ajar, creaking back and forth in the evening breeze. I announced myself loudly, identifying as police, waiting for any response from inside. Nothing. The house smelled like old newspapers and something sweet and rotten, like fruit that had been sitting in the heat too long. Through the doorway, I could see a narrow hallway with faded wallpaper, some kind of nautical pattern with tiny sailboats, and a staircase leading up into darkness. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, but the woman behind me started getting louder, almost wailing now. "He shot me, please, he shot me." Janet stayed with her while I cleared the first floor, weapon drawn, calling out as I moved through each room. The living room had this ancient green couch covered in plastic, like something from the 70s, and there were prescription bottles scattered across the coffee table. I noted the name on them, Diane Garrett. The kitchen was worse, dishes piled in the sink with flies buzzing around them, and the garbage can overflowing with takeout containers that had been there for days, maybe weeks. But no sign of anyone else, no evidence of violence, no bullet holes, no blood. When I came back outside, the woman had sat down on the driveway, rocking back and forth with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face and said something different this time. "He's still in there. He never left." But we'd just cleared the house and I knew for certain nobody was home. Backup arrived within minutes. 2 more units, including Sergeant Bob Fitzgerald, a 20-year veteran who knew every family and every story in this neighborhood. When he saw the woman in the driveway, his face changed in a way I'd never seen before, like someone had just walked over his grave. He pulled me aside, keeping his voice low, and asked if I'd gotten her name. I told him about the prescription bottles for Diane Garrett, and he actually took a step back from me. "That's impossible," he said, rubbing his jaw with that nervous habit he had. "Diane Garrett died in this house 4 years ago. Her husband, Ronald Garrett, shot her 3 times in the chest during an argument. We never caught him. He disappeared that same night." The woman was still sitting there, maybe 15 feet away from us, humming something now, some old tune I couldn't quite place. Bob said we needed to get her to the hospital for evaluation. that she was probably having some kind of breakdown. Maybe she'd heard the story about what happened here. But here's where everything went sideways. The woman absolutely refused to leave the property. When Janet and the other officers tried to guide her to the ambulance that had just arrived, she became hysterical, screaming and clawing at anyone who touched her. She kept pointing at the house, yelling that she couldn't leave, that he wouldn't let her leave, that she'd tried to leave before but she always ended up back here. The EMTs eventually sedated her, and as they were loading her into the ambulance, she grabbed my sleeve with surprising strength. Her eyes were completely lucid for just a moment, and she said, "Check the basement wall behind the water heater, the new concrete. That's where he put her." Then the sedatives kicked in, and she went limp. We stood there in that driveway, 5 officers and 2 EMTs, all looking at each other, and I could tell everyone was thinking the same thing. We needed to check that basement. Bob made the call to get a warrant while we secured the scene. Within an hour, we had permission to search the property thoroughly, and I volunteered to go down first with Janet. The basement door was in the kitchen, painted shut with so many layers that we had to use a crowbar to get it open. The smell that came up from below was thick and damp, like wet earth mixed with something chemical. The wooden stairs groaned under our weight, and I had to duck to avoid hitting my head on the exposed beams. The basement was exactly what you'd expect. Concrete floor, stone foundation walls, boxes of molding Christmas decorations, and there, in the corner, an old rusty water heater that looked like it hadn't worked in years. Behind it, just like she'd said, was a section of concrete that was clearly different from the rest of the floor, lighter in color, smoother, probably poured within the last few years. Janet called for the forensics team while I stood there staring at that patch of new concrete, feeling like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The forensics team worked through the night, carefully breaking through the concrete with specialized equipment. I stayed there the whole time, couldn't bring myself to leave, even when Bob told me to go home and get some rest. Around 3 in the morning, they found something. Not Diane Garrett. We knew she'd been cremated by her family years ago, but documents wrapped in plastic, a driver's license, social security card, and passport, all belonging to a woman named Carla Hendrick. When they ran the name, we learned she'd been reported missing from Pennsylvania 6 years ago, right around the time Ronald Garrett would have been on the run. The theory started forming pretty quickly. Ronald had killed this woman, stolen her identity for someone, and hidden the evidence here. But there was more. In the same hole, they found men's clothing, a wallet with Ronald's actual ID, and something that made everyone stop talking. A suicide note dated 3 years ago in Ronald's handwriting, saying he couldn't live with what he'd done to both of them. The woman from the driveway was identified at the hospital as Carla Hendrick, alive, traumatized, but very much alive. The DNA confirmation took a few days, but it matched. She'd been living in that house for the past 6 years, held captive by Ronald Garrett, who had forced her to assume his dead wife's identity. The psychological evaluation revealed something even more disturbing. Ronald had made her wear Diane's clothes, answer to Diane's name, and punished her severely whenever she claimed to be anyone else. After 3 years of this, when Ronald apparently killed himself in the basement, we found his remains buried in another section we hadn't initially checked. Carla's mind had fractured. She'd continued living in the house, trapped by the psychological prison he'd built, genuinely believing she was Diane Garrett and that she'd been shot. The trauma specialist explained that in moments of clarity, like when we found her, she was trying to tell us the truth the only way her broken mind could, by repeating Diane's last words, by saying "he shot me," because in her confused state, she'd become Diane, living out her final moments over and over again. What haunts me most about that night isn't the bodies we found, or even Carla's condition. It's the 3 years she spent alone in that house after Ronald died, unable to leave, unable to remember who she really was, just existing in this horrible loop of trauma. The neighbors said they'd seen Diane occasionally getting mail or taking out garbage, always at odd hours, always alone. They thought she was just reclusive after what happened to the real Diane. Nobody questioned it. Nobody checked. She'd been crying for help in the only way she knew how, and it took a random welfare check for anyone to notice. Carla's family in Pennsylvania had held memorial services for her, had mourned her, had moved on with their lives believing she was dead. The reunion was complicated. She didn't recognize them at first, kept insisting her name was Diane, kept asking where Ronald was, if he was still angry with her. The investigation revealed the full extent of Ronald's plan. After murdering his wife Diane, he'd fled to Pennsylvania where he met Carla at a truck stop where she worked nights. He'd charmed her, convinced her to come with him for what she thought would be a weekend trip. Instead, he brought her back to the house where he'd killed his wife and systematically destroyed her sense of self. The basement became her prison for the first year until he was confident she wouldn't run. He'd legally changed documents, threatened her family if she ever tried to contact them, and, most disturbingly, made her practice Diane's signature until it was perfect, had her memorize details about Diane's life from photo albums and journals he'd kept. The police psychologist theorized that Ronald himself had started to break down, unable to distinguish between his victim and his wife, ultimately leading to his suicide when the delusion became unbearable. We found his body exactly where Carla, in her moment of clarity, had told us to look. He dug his own grave in the basement, taken a massive overdose of the same medications he'd been forcing on Carla, and covered himself with bags of concrete mix that hardened around him when the basement flooded during a storm. 2 years after that night, I got a letter from Carla. She was living with her sister in Oregon, working part-time at a library, slowly rebuilding her life. She thanked me for listening to her that night, for checking the basement even though what she was saying sounded impossible. She said she still sometimes forgot her real name, still occasionally signed things as Diane, but therapy was helping. She ended the letter with something that stuck with me. I spent 6 years dying in that house and 3 years being dead. You gave me the chance to be alive again. I drive past that house sometimes. It's been sold now, renovated, painted a cheerful blue with new landscaping. A young family lives there, and I've seen kids playing in the same driveway where I first saw Carla that September night. They have no idea what happened in their home, and honestly, that's probably for the best. But every time I pass by, I remember her standing there barefoot, pressing her hands to her chest, trying to tell us a truth that was both a lie and the most honest thing she could say. He shot me. The call came through at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday night in October 2022, just as I was finishing my patrol route through the financial district. I'd been with the department for 8 years at that point, mostly working nights because the pay was better, and honestly, I liked the quiet. My partner that night was Officer James Sullivan, a rookie who'd only been on the force for about 6 months. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio about a silent alarm at the Brennan Tower, this 20-story office building right in the heart of downtown. What struck me as odd right away was that the alarm company had tried calling the building's security desk 3 times, with no answer. The overnight security guard, a guy named Vincent, always picked up on the first ring. I knew because we'd responded to false alarms there before, usually just cleaning crews accidentally tripping motion sensors. As we pulled up to the building, the first thing I noticed was that the lobby lights were all on, blazing bright against the dark street. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the security desk was empty, Vincent's jacket still draped over his chair, his coffee mug sitting there with steam still rising from it. Sullivan and I exchanged glances. That knot you get in your gut when something's genuinely wrong started tightening. The front doors were unlocked, which was completely against protocol for that time of night. We announced ourselves as we entered, our voices echoing off the marble floors and walls. The elevator panel showed that 3 elevators were stuck on different floors, the 7th, the 12th, and the 14th. None of them would respond when we hit the call button. We had to take the stairs, and as we started climbing, I could hear doors slamming somewhere above us, like someone was running through the building, opening and closing offices. On the 7th floor, we found the first real sign of trouble. The hallway was lit up like midday. Every single overhead light turned on, and at least 6 office doors were wide open. Papers were scattered across the hallway floor, some of them medical forms with patient information. Others looked like billing statements. Sullivan called for backup while I started checking the offices one by one. In the 3rd office, belonging to a Dr. Nathan Reeves, according to the nameplate, the scene was chaos. File cabinets had been yanked open, their contents dumped everywhere. The computer monitor was smashed, and there were fresh scratches on the desk where someone had apparently tried to pry open the locked drawers with something metal. What really made my pulse spike was finding a manila folder labeled Federal Investigation Confidential, torn in half and stuffed partially into a paper shredder that had jammed. The machine was still warm, like someone had been using it minutes before we arrived. Sullivan found Vincent on the 12th floor, locked in a supply closet, duct tape over his mouth and zip-tied to a shelf unit. The poor guy was terrified, his eyes wide with panic. And when we cut him loose, he immediately started babbling about 2 people in ski masks who'd forced him upstairs at gunpoint around 2:15 a.m. He said they knew exactly where they were going, headed straight for specific offices without checking directories or asking him for directions. They'd made him disable the security cameras from the main panel, threatening to hurt him if he didn't comply. Vincent kept repeating that one of them, a woman based on her voice, had said something about cleaning up the mess before the feds come knocking. The other one, a man with a slight southern drawl, had been carrying a large duffel bag that Vincent heard clinking with what sounded like computer equipment or hard drives. While Sullivan stayed with Vincent and waited for the paramedics, I continued searching the building. The 14th floor was where things got really disturbing. The entire hallway reeked of bleach and burning plastic. I found the source in a corner office. Someone had dumped what looked like acid or some kind of industrial cleaner all over a pile of hard drives and USB sticks in a metal trash can. The devices were still dissolving, making this hissing, crackling sound that set my teeth on edge. The office belonged to Dr. Reeves, too. Apparently his private practice's administrative headquarters. Every single filing cabinet had been emptied, and there were burn marks on the carpet where someone had clearly tried to start a fire but failed. On the desk, I found a half-burned patient list with hundreds of names, some circled in red ink. Next to it was a printout of a news article dated just 3 days earlier. Dr. Nathan Reeves had been found dead in his home, apparent suicide, while under federal investigation for billing Medicare for procedures that never happened. The timeline started making 6 sense when I found a suicide note in the doctor's desk drawer, dated the day before his death. In shaky handwriting, he'd written that he couldn't face prison, couldn't handle the shame of what he'd done. But what caught my attention was the last line. "Tell Miranda and Howard I'm sorry for dragging them into this." Our backup had arrived by then, and one of the detectives, Lieutenant Frost, immediately recognized those names. Miranda Reeves was the doctor's daughter, a nurse who worked in his practice. Howard Kellerman was his business partner, another doctor who ran the billing department. Both had been named in the federal investigation as co-conspirators. The building's entry logs, which the intruders hadn't thought to destroy, showed that someone had used Miranda's keycard to enter the building at 2:08 a.m. She must have kept it even after her father's death, probably planning this whole thing to destroy evidence before the feds seized everything. We were still processing the scene when dispatch radioed that a silver sedan had been pulled over for speeding about 3 miles from the building, heading toward the interstate. The driver matched the description Vincent had given us. A woman, early 30s, with distinctive green eyes he'd noticed when her mask slipped. When officers searched the vehicle, they found 2 ski masks stuffed under the passenger seat and a duffel bag in the trunk containing 12 hard drives, stacks of patient files, and a laptop that was still logged into the medical practice's billing system. Miranda Reeves was in the driver's seat, her hands still reeking of bleach, with chemical burns on her fingers from handling the acid without proper gloves. She didn't even try to deny it, just kept muttering that her father was innocent, that the whole thing was Howard's idea, that they were just trying to protect her father's reputation. The passenger, who turned out to be her boyfriend Keith Lawson, not Howard as we'd assumed, had already started talking before they even got him to the station. Keith's confession painted an even darker picture. According to him, Miranda had been planning this for weeks, ever since her father's death. She was convinced that someone had set him up, that Howard had been the real mastermind behind the Medicare fraud, and had somehow manipulated the evidence to make her father take the fall. She'd spent days going through her father's emails and records at home, finding discrepancies that she believed proved Howard had been submitting the fraudulent claims using her father's credentials. The plan was to break into both offices, her father's and Howard's, to steal any remaining evidence and then leak it to the media, showing that her father was just a patsy. But when they got to Howard's office on the 16th floor, they found something that changed everything. There was a recorded conversation on Howard's computer dated 2 days before Dr. Reeves's death, where Howard was clearly heard threatening to expose some personal secret about the doctor if he didn't take full responsibility for the fraud scheme. The recording was chilling. I listened to it later during the investigation, and Howard's voice was calm, almost casual, as he told Dr. Reeves about photographs he had of him from a medical conference in Vegas 5 years ago. Photographs with a woman who wasn't his wife, a pharmaceutical sales rep named Angela, who'd been providing him with kickbacks for prescribing certain medications. Howard had kept these photos as insurance, and now he was cashing in. Either Dr. Reeves would confess to being the sole perpetrator of the Medicare fraud, or Howard would send everything to his wife, his patients, and the medical board. The doctor's voice on the recording was broken, defeated. He agreed to take the fall, and 2 days later, he was dead. Miranda had apparently found this recording and completely lost it, smashing Howard's computer with a hammer she'd brought, which explained the clanking sound Vincent had heard in the duffel bag. She'd tried to burn the office, but the building's sprinkler system had activated, which is what triggered the initial alarm. What really got to me, what still keeps me up some nights, was finding Dr. Reeves's real suicide note hidden behind the fake one in that desk drawer. The one he'd actually written for his family, not the sanitized version Howard had probably forced him to leave. In it, he told his daughter that he'd made terrible mistakes, that he'd let greed cloud his judgment, but that Howard was the devil who'd orchestrated everything. He begged Miranda not to seek revenge, to let the federal investigation run its course, that they'd eventually figure out Howard's involvement. But Miranda never saw that note. It had been sealed in an envelope marked, to be opened only after Howard Kellerman's arrest. The doctor had hidden it, probably hoping someone would find it during the investigation. Instead, his daughter had thrown away her entire life trying to expose the truth herself, becoming a criminal in the process. She'd been right about Howard, but she'd gone about proving it in the worst possible way. The federal agents arrived at dawn, taking over the entire investigation. They'd already been planning to raid both offices that morning. We'd accidentally stumbled into the middle of a 2-year investigation that was just about to close. They had Howard under surveillance and were hours away from arresting him. The evidence Miranda and Keith had tried to destroy, the feds already had copies of everything, backed up on their servers months ago. The recording of Howard's blackmail? They had it too, along with dozens of other recordings Howard had made, apparently being paranoid enough to record all his conversations. Miranda's break-in had actually complicated their case, contaminating crime scenes and destroying original documents they needed for court. But here's the part that really messed with everyone's heads. Howard had been at the hospital that entire night, performing emergency surgery with 12 witnesses. He couldn't have been involved in the break-in, but when they arrested him the next morning, he seemed genuinely surprised that someone had tried to destroy the evidence. Turned out he'd been planning to flee the country that very day, had a flight booked to Costa Rica under a false name. Miranda ended up getting 7 years for breaking and entering, destruction of evidence, and assault with a deadly weapon for threatening Vincent with the gun, which turned out to be Keith's legally registered pistol. Keith got 3 years as an accomplice. Howard got 25 to life for the Medicare fraud, extortion, and indirectly causing Dr. Reeves's death. The prosecutors successfully argued that his blackmail constituted depraved indifference murder. Vincent quit his security job that same week, said he couldn't handle being in empty buildings at night anymore. As for me, I still drive by the Brennan Tower sometimes on my patrol route. They've upgraded their security system, added more cameras, stationed 2 guards at night instead of 1. But whenever I see those lights on late at night, I think about Miranda, sitting in prison, knowing she was right about everything but having destroyed her life trying to prove it. The truth would have come out anyway, just 12 hours later, without anyone else getting hurt. Sometimes the worst part about being a cop isn't the dangerous calls or the violence. It's seeing how people destroy themselves trying to do what they think is right, especially when they actually are right, but choose the wrong way to prove it. I was 2 years into my job as a patrol officer in a small Colorado town when I got the call that still keeps me up at night. It was a Wednesday evening in early March, around 7 p.m., and I'd just finished dealing with a minor fender bender on Main Street. Dispatch came through about a missing person report, a teenage girl who hadn't come home from school. At that point in my career, I'd handled a few runaways, mostly kids who'd crash at a friend's house and forget to call their parents. My partner that night, Officer Bradley, was out with the flu, so I headed to the address alone, expecting this would be another case of a teenager testing boundaries. The house sat at the end of Cedar Drive, one of those split-level homes from the 80s with faded yellow siding and a basketball hoop in the driveway that had seen better days. When I pulled up, every light in the house was blazing, and I could see shapes moving behind the curtains, multiple people pacing back and forth. The mother, Lisa, met me at the door before I could even knock. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in dark rivers, and she kept twisting a dish towel in her hands like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Behind her, I counted at least 6 other people crowded in the living room. The father, an older couple I assumed were grandparents, a woman who looked like Lisa's sister, and 2 teenage boys who hung back near the hallway, whispering to each other. Anna had been missing for approximately 4 hours at that point. She normally got home from Riverside High around 3:30, and Lisa had started calling her friends by 4:15. The girl was 17, a junior, good grades according to her mother, who kept repeating that fact like it was some kind of protective spell. I pulled out my notepad and started with the basics. Full name, Anna Marie Carpenter, height 5'6", weight around 120 pounds. What she'd been wearing that morning: jeans, a green hoodie with the school logo, white sneakers. The father, Douglas, stood by the fireplace with his arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. He hadn't said a word yet, just stared at the family photos on the mantel, like he was trying to will his daughter to walk through the front door. That's when things got strange. I asked if Anna had ever run away before, or if she'd been having problems at home or school. Lisa immediately said no, absolutely not. Anna was a perfect kid who told them everything. But I caught the grandmother, a stern woman with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun, shoot a look at the teenage boys. One of them, who I later learned was Anna's cousin Trevor, shifted uncomfortably and muttered something under his breath. When I asked him to speak up, the room erupted. The aunt, Maureen, suddenly blurted out that she'd seen Anna sneaking out her bedroom window at least twice in the past month, always after midnight. Lisa spun around like she'd been slapped, screaming that Maureen was lying, that she would have heard if her daughter was climbing out windows in the middle of the night. The grandfather, Walter, tried to calm everyone down, but his voice got drowned out in the chaos. Trevor's younger brother, Kyle, who couldn't have been more than 14, suddenly piped up from his corner. He said Anna had been acting weird for weeks, always on her phone, smiling at the screen, then quickly hiding it whenever someone walked by. She'd started wearing makeup to school, the kind their strict parents never would have allowed, but she'd wash it off before coming home. Kyle said he'd tried to talk to her about it last week, but she'd told him to mind his own business, and threatened to tell his parents about the vape pen she knew he kept hidden in his backpack. The kid looked terrified admitting all this, glancing between his parents and mine like he wasn't sure who was going to kill him first. Douglas finally spoke up, his voice rough like sandpaper. He said they needed to check her laptop, her social media, everything. But when we went upstairs to Anna's room, painted lavender with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, still childish in a way that made my chest tight, we found her laptop missing. Her school backpack was there, tossed on her unmade bed, but the MacBook she always used for homework was gone. Her phone was obviously with her wherever she was. Lisa started hyperventilating, saying Anna never went anywhere without telling someone, that someone must have taken her, kidnapped her from school. But Maureen, still angry about being called a liar, pointed out that Anna's favorite jacket was missing from her closet, along with the small floral duffel bag she used for sleepovers. I called for backup and started a formal missing person report while the family continued to argue. The tension in that house was suffocating, years of buried resentments and unspoken suspicions all bubbling to the surface. Lisa accused Maureen of always undermining her parenting, while Maureen shot back that Lisa was blind to what was happening under her own roof. The grandmother kept muttering prayers under her breath, clutching a rosary with arthritic fingers. Douglas disappeared into the garage and came back with a box of old cell phone bills, frantically scanning through them for any unusual numbers. Trevor finally admitted he'd seen Anna talking to some older guy at the mall food court about 3 weeks ago. Someone definitely not from their school. The guy had tattoos covering both arms and drove a black pickup truck with tinted windows. Anna had begged Trevor not to tell anyone, said the guy was just a friend's older brother who was giving her advice about college. By 10 p.m., we'd issued an Amber Alert and had units checking all the usual spots: the mall, local parks, the movie theater, her friends' houses. But every lead came up empty. Her best friend Sophia seemed genuinely shocked and worried, said Anna had seemed normal at school that day, maybe a little distracted during lunch, but nothing alarming. The principal confirmed Anna had attended all her classes and was seen leaving through the main entrance at 3:10 p.m., walking toward the student parking lot alone. Security footage showed her getting into a dark-colored sedan. Not her mother's car, not any vehicle the family recognized. The quality was too grainy to make out the plates or the driver. That's when the real panic set in. Lisa collapsed on the couch, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe, while Douglas punched a hole in the hallway wall, his knuckles coming away bloody. The next 3 days were hell for everyone involved. I barely went home, catching maybe 4 hours of sleep in my patrol car between shifts. We interviewed every student in Anna's classes, checked traffic cameras along every possible route out of town, even brought in a K-9 unit to search the woods behind the school. The FBI got involved on day 2, setting up a command center in the carpenter's living room. They went through Anna's social media with a fine-tooth comb and found something that made everyone's blood run cold. She'd been messaging with someone using the handle CollegeCoach23 on Instagram for the past 2 months. The account was fake, the profile picture stolen from some fitness influencer in California. The messages started innocent enough: advice about SAT prep, college essays, scholarship opportunities. But they'd gradually become more personal, more manipulative. This person knew exactly what to say to a stressed-out teenager with strict parents. They promised her freedom, understanding, a chance to be herself without judgment. On the 4th day, Saturday morning around 6 a.m., I got the call that Anna was at the hospital. She'd walked into the emergency room alone, dehydrated and exhausted but physically unharmed. When I arrived, she was sitting in a bed in the pediatric ward, staring at the wall with hollow eyes. She looked smaller somehow, like she'd aged years in those 4 days, but also reverted to being a lost child. Lisa and Douglas were there, Lisa stroking Anna's hair while Douglas stood guard by the door like he was ready to fight anyone who came near. Anna wouldn't talk at first, just shook her head whenever we asked where she'd been. The FBI brought in a specialist, a woman who worked specifically with grooming victims. After 3 hours alone with her, Anna finally broke down. She'd been at a motel 2 towns over in room 237 at the Sunset Lodge, waiting for Jason to pick her up and drive her to California, where he'd supposedly arranged a scholarship interview at UCLA. Jason never showed up. Anna waited in that motel room for 3 days, too ashamed and terrified to call home. surviving on vending machine snacks and tap water. She'd paid for the room with $300 she'd saved from babysitting jobs, told the desk clerk she was 18 and waiting for her boyfriend. The person behind the messages had coached her on exactly what to say, what to do, how to avoid being tracked. They'd convinced her that her parents would never understand her dreams, that they were holding her back from her true potential. When she finally realized she'd been played, that Jason was never coming, she walked the 8 miles to the hospital in the early morning darkness. The FBI traced the Instagram account through multiple VPNs and proxy servers, but hit dead end after dead end. Whoever this predator was, they knew how to cover their tracks. The motel had no security cameras in the parking lot, and the desk clerk barely remembered Anna checking in. The aftermath was somehow worse than the disappearance itself. The family completely fractured. Maureen and Lisa haven't spoken since that night, each blaming the other for missing the warning signs. Douglas installed cameras in every room of the house and tracking apps on Anna's new phone, turning their home into a prison. Anna had to switch schools because everyone knew what had happened, whispers following her down every hallway. She goes to therapy twice a week now, but her mother told me she still wakes up screaming sometimes, dreaming that she's back in that motel room waiting for someone who was never real. The FBI keeps the case open, but we all know the truth. Whoever groomed Anna is probably doing the same thing to another vulnerable kid right now, maybe in another state, using a different fake profile. That's what haunts me most about this case. We got Anna back, but we never caught the monster who almost destroyed her. They're still out there, and we couldn't do a damn thing to stop them. I'd been patrolling the east side of Indianapolis for about 6 years when I got the call that still keeps me up some nights. It was a Tuesday in early May, around 11 at night, and dispatch sent me to check on Mrs. Eleanor Briggs over on Ashwood Lane. She was 73, lived alone in this old 2-story house with peeling yellow paint and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. I knew her place because she'd called us twice before about raccoons getting into her garbage. The dispatcher said she sounded different this time, though. Not angry or frustrated like usual, but genuinely scared. She kept insisting someone was running circles around her backyard, had been doing it for the past hour, and she could hear them laughing. I remember thinking it was probably just teenagers being stupid, maybe some kids from the neighborhood trying to scare an old lady for kicks. When I pulled up to her house, all the lights were on inside, even the ones in the attic that I'd never seen lit before. Mrs. Briggs met me at the front door wearing a housecoat over her nightgown, and her gray hair was all messy like she'd been pulling at it. She grabbed my arm the second I stepped onto the porch, her fingers digging in harder than you'd expect from someone her age. She kept pointing toward the back of the house, telling me, "She's still out there, officer, she's still running." I asked her to describe what she'd seen, and she said it was a young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing what looked like a white summer dress. The woman had been running in these perfect circles around the big oak tree in her backyard, arms stretched out like kids do when they pretend to be airplanes. Mrs. Briggs said the woman would run for a few minutes, stop to stare at the house, then start running again while making this soft humming sound that carried through the night air. I told Mrs. Briggs to stay inside and lock the door while I checked the backyard. I walked around the side of the house with my flashlight out, trying to move quietly through the narrow pathway between her house and the neighbor's fence. The motion sensor light on the back corner of her house kicked on when I turned the corner, flooding the yard with harsh white light. The grass was overgrown, maybe ankle-high, and I could see clear tracks where someone had been moving through it. There were these circular patterns worn into the grass around the oak tree, just like Mrs. Briggs had described. The tracks were fresh. The grass was still bent and hadn't started to spring back up yet. What really caught my attention, though, were the footprints. They were small, definitely from bare feet, and there was something weird about the pattern. The person had been running on their tiptoes the entire time, leaving these deep, pointed impressions in the soft ground. I followed the tracks with my flashlight and found where they led straight to the back door, then away again, then back to the door over and over like someone had been testing it. The back door itself had scratch marks all around the lock, fresh ones that had torn through the old white paint down to the bare wood underneath. Some of the scratches were at different heights, like whoever did it had been crouching, standing, even reaching up high above the lock. I tried the door handle and it was locked, but it felt loose, like someone had been yanking on it hard enough to damage the mechanism inside. I started walking the perimeter of the yard, checking behind the tool shed and near the old greenhouse frame that Mrs. Briggs had told me her late husband built 40 years ago. That's when I heard it, this faint giggling coming from somewhere past the back fence. It wasn't a child's laugh, but it had this playful quality that made the hair on my neck stand up. I shined my light toward the fence but saw nothing except the woods that bordered all the houses on this side of Ashwood Lane. The giggling stopped the moment my light hit the tree line, replaced by complete silence, the kind where even the crickets stopped chirping. I spent another 20 minutes searching the yard and the edge of the woods, but found nothing else. When I went back to talk to Mrs. Briggs, she was watching from her kitchen window, her face pale under the fluorescent light. I told her I'd found evidence of trespassing and would file a report, suggested she might want to consider getting better locks or maybe some security cameras. She just kept shaking her head, saying, "She'll be back, officer. She always comes back." I asked her what she meant by always, and she told me this had been happening for about 2 weeks now. But this was the first time the person had tried to get inside. She said she'd seen the woman's face once, pressed against her bedroom window on the second floor. Young, pretty even, but with something wrong about her expression, like she was mimicking what she thought a smile should look like. Mrs. Briggs had been sleeping downstairs on the couch ever since. I gave her my card, told her to call immediately if anything else happened, and said I'd have patrol cars swing by her house more frequently over the next few nights. For the next 3 weeks, I made it a point to drive past Mrs. Briggs's house during my shifts. Sometimes I'd see her porch light flicking on and off, which she told me she did when she heard noises outside. Other neighbors on Ashwood Lane started calling in complaints too. Mr. Jeffries, who lived 2 houses down, said he'd caught someone going through his garbage at 3 in the morning, a young woman in a dirty white dress who ran off the moment his dog started barking. The Pham family across the street reported finding muddy handprints all over their daughter's bedroom window, even though her room was on the 2nd floor and there was no ladder or tree nearby. The strangest report came from a jogger who said he'd seen someone sitting in the oak tree in Mrs. Briggs' backyard at dawn, just sitting there on a branch, watching the house with their head tilted sideways like a bird. By the time I responded to that call, whoever it was had vanished, leaving only broken branches and more of those barefoot prints in the morning dew. Then came that Monday morning in early June when everything changed. I was just starting my shift when dispatch called about Mrs. Briggs. A neighbor had noticed her front door standing wide open since the previous evening, and she wasn't answering her phone. I was the closest unit, so I responded immediately. The house was quiet when I arrived, that kind of heavy quiet that makes you hold your breath without thinking about it. I announced myself and entered through the open door, finding Mrs. Briggs in her living room armchair, still in her nightgown and housecoat. She'd been dead for at least 12 hours, according to the coroner. Natural causes, they said, probably her heart. But what stuck with me was the scene itself. Every single window in the house was open, curtains pulled back and tied with neat little bows. The back door was wide open too, and there were those same muddy footprints leading from the backyard, through the kitchen, stopping right in front of Mrs. Briggs's chair. The television was on but muted, and someone had arranged all her family photos from the mantel in a perfect circle on the coffee table, facing her body. The official report listed it as death by natural causes with some vandalism, probably local kids who found her after she'd already passed. But I knew better. Those footprints were still fresh when I arrived, still damp on the hardwood floor. Mrs. Briggs' eyes were closed, which might seem normal, except her neighbor swore she'd seen them open through the window the night before, when she'd first noticed the door ajar. Someone had been in that house with Mrs. Briggs' body, had opened every window like they were airing the place out, and had stayed long enough to play with her belongings. The house went up for sale immediately. Her son from Michigan wanted nothing to do with it, said the place had always given him the creeps even as a kid. It sold fast, below market price, to a young couple with 2 kids who were moving from Ohio. The Brennan family seemed nice enough when I met them during a routine patrol introduction, excited about the big yard and the quiet neighborhood. I wanted to warn them, but what would I say? That someone had been stalking the previous owner who died of natural causes? It took exactly 2 weeks before the first call came in from the Brennan house. Mrs. Brennan, Amy, sounded just like Mrs. Briggs had that first night, scared but trying to stay rational. Their 8-year-old daughter, Megan, had been complaining about a lady who watched her through her bedroom window at night. Amy had assumed it was just adjustment anxiety from the move until she went to check herself and saw muddy fingerprints on the outside of the glass, fresh ones still wet. The window was on the 2nd floor, just like at the fam house. I found the same barefoot prints in the flower bed below, but this time there were handprints too, pressed into the siding of the house like someone had been climbing up the wall itself. The prints were small, definitely female, but the spacing was wrong. They were too far apart, like whoever made them had unnaturally long arms or was moving in a way that didn't make physical sense. I took photos, filed another report, and increased patrols, but I knew we were dealing with something beyond a simple trespasser. The situation escalated quickly after that night. The Brennans installed security cameras, but they would mysteriously stop working whenever the woman appeared, showing only static during the exact time frames when things happened. Their 6-year-old son, Brady, started having night terrors, screaming about the backwards lady who walked funny in their backyard. Amy found him one morning standing at his window at 4 a.m., fully asleep but carrying on a whole conversation with someone outside, nodding and laughing at responses only he could hear. When she woke him up, he had no memory of it but had dirt under his fingernails like he'd been outside. Then came the night when Tom Brennan called 911 in a panic. He'd gotten up to use the bathroom and found wet footprints leading from their back door up the stairs, stopping right outside their bedroom. The door had been cracked open just an inch, and he swore he could see an eye peering through the gap. When he yanked the door open, no one was there, but the wet prints continued down the hall to both kids' rooms. Both children were safe in their beds, but Megan's window was wide open. Curtains tied back with the same neat little bows I'd seen at Mrs. Briggs' house. That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't just keep filing reports and waiting for something terrible to happen. I started digging into the history of the house and the neighborhood on my own time. Property records, old police reports, newspaper archives, anything that might explain what was happening. What I found made everything click into place in the worst way possible. In 1996, a 22-year-old woman named Rebecca Hollis had lived in a group home about a mile away, a facility for adults with severe developmental disabilities. She'd escaped one night and had been found 3 days later in the woods behind Ashwood Lane, dead from exposure. The report noted that Rebecca had an obsession with children and families, would often be found watching houses through windows, and had a peculiar way of moving. She walked on her tiptoes and had unusual flexibility due to a connective tissue disorder. The group home had closed down in 1998 after multiple incidents of residents wandering off. I cross-referenced more recent missing persons reports and found something that made me sick to my stomach. Over the past 3 years, 4 different women from various psychiatric facilities within a 50-mile radius had gone missing, all bearing similar physical descriptions to Rebecca Hollis, all with similar behavioral patterns noted in their files. I brought all this information to my sergeant, convinced we were dealing with a dangerous individual who was specifically targeting houses with children, someone who might have known Rebecca's story and was imitating it, or worse, someone who'd been inspired by it. We set up surveillance on the Brennan house for 3 nights straight. On the 3rd night, we caught her. She was exactly as everyone had described, young, maybe 24, wearing a filthy white dress, moving through the yard in that strange tiptoe run. When we moved in to apprehend her, she didn't run. She just stood there under the oak tree, smiling that wrong smile Mrs. Briggs had described, humming a children's song. Her name was Celia Grant, and she'd walked away from a psychiatric facility in Bloomington 2 months prior. She'd been living in the woods, stealing food, watching families through their windows. The Brennan house, she said in her interview, felt warm like home was supposed to feel. She knew about Mrs. Briggs dying, had been in the house that night, had closed her eyes because she looked sad. When asked why she targeted houses with children, she just tilted her head and said she was looking for her siblings, that her family was hiding them from her. Celia's been institutionalized again, hopefully somewhere more secure, and the Brennans moved out within a month. The house on Ashwood Lane is for sale again, and every time I patrol past it, I can't help but check the backyard, looking for footprints around that old oak tree. The night I arrested Frank Donovan still gives me chills, not because of anything supernatural, but because of how close I came to letting a cop killer slip through my fingers. I was 28 then, working the graveyard shift for the Monroe County Sheriff's Department in upstate New York. It was early November 2017, one of those nights where the fog rolled in thick off Lake Ontario, making the back roads feel like tunnels through nothing. I'd been on the force for 6 years, partnered with Rex, my German Shepherd K9, for the last 3. That dog had instincts I'd learned to trust completely. He could smell fear, aggression, and drugs better than any human ever could. Most nights were routine: drunk drivers, speeding tickets, the occasional domestic call. But that particular night, around 2 a.m., I was parked near the intersection of Route 31 and Old Mill Road, just watching for anything unusual. The area was known for late-night drug runs coming up from Rochester, so I kept my radar on and Rex sleeping in the back of the cruiser. I noticed the old Ford pickup doing about 40 in a 55 zone, which immediately caught my attention. Nobody drives under the speed limit at 2 a.m. unless they're drunk or trying to avoid attention. The truck had Illinois plates, covered in road grime but still readable. When I ran them through dispatch, everything came back clean. Registered to a Frank Donovan, 62 years old, no warrants, just a couple old speeding tickets. Still, something made me pull out behind him. Maybe it was the way the truck seemed to drift slightly within the lane, or how the driver kept checking his mirrors, even though we were the only 2 vehicles on that stretch of road for miles. Rex had woken up when I started following the truck, his ears perked forward, watching through the cage partition. After about a quarter mile, I hit my lights. The truck immediately slowed down and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, kicking up dust in my headlights. Everything seemed normal at first. The driver killed the engine, interior light came on, hands visible on the steering wheel. Textbook compliance. I approached the driver's side with my flashlight in hand, Rex still in the cruiser but watching intently through the window. The man behind the wheel looked exactly like his license photo. Weathered face, gray beard trimmed short, deep-set eyes that stayed fixed straight ahead. He was wearing a faded denim jacket over what looked like work clothes, and his hands had that permanent grease stain you see on mechanics. When I asked for his license and registration, he moved slowly, deliberately, narrating each action like he'd been through traffic stops before. His voice was gravelly, measured, told me he was heading to Buffalo to visit his sister, that he'd been driving since Chicago and was getting tired. The paperwork all matched up. Insurance was current. Nothing seemed wrong except for this tension in the air I couldn't quite place. I asked him to wait while I went back to run his information through the system again. Standard procedure when something doesn't feel right. That's when everything changed. The second I opened my cruiser door, Rex went absolutely ballistic. I'd never seen him react like that to anyone who wasn't actively threatening us or carrying serious drugs. He was snarling, barking, throwing himself against the cage partition so hard the whole vehicle was rocking. His teeth were bared, hackles raised from his neck all the way down his spine, and his eyes were locked on that pickup truck like it contained the devil himself. The sound was so intense it echoed off the trees lining the road. Through my side mirror, I could see Donovan's head turn slightly, watching us in his mirror. His hands hadn't moved from the wheel, but I noticed his knuckles were white from gripping it. Rex's reaction made my decision for me. 16 years of combined experience between us was screaming that something was seriously wrong with this picture. I radioed for backup, telling dispatch I had a K9 alert during a routine stop, then grabbed Rex's lead. The moment I let Rex out of the cruiser, he nearly pulled me off my feet, lunging toward the truck. I'd worked with him through drug busts, armed robberies, even a manhunt through the woods once, but I'd never felt him pull this hard. His entire 90 pounds of muscle was focused on that vehicle like a guided missile. I had to plant my feet and use both hands on the lead to control him. When I approached the driver's window again, Donovan's demeanor had completely shifted. The calm, tired traveler was gone. Now his jaw was clenched, a vein pulsing visibly on his temple, and his breathing had gotten shallow and quick. I told him I needed him to step out of the vehicle, that my K9 had alerted and we needed to search the truck. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved. Donovan's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror, to me, to Rex, who was still snarling like something out of a nightmare, then back to the road ahead. His right hand twitched slightly toward the gear shift, and I immediately put my hand on my weapon, telling him firmly to keep his hands where I could see them. He complied, but slowly, like every movement was being calculated. When he finally opened the door and stepped out, Rex's barking intensified to the point where I was worried he might actually break free from my grip. Donovan was shorter than he'd looked sitting down, maybe 5'8", but built solid. He moved with a slight limp I hadn't noticed in his license photo, favoring his left leg. I had him stand by the rear of the truck with his hands on the tailgate, while I secured Rex back in the cruiser. The dog was too agitated to be useful for a search, and I needed to focus. With Donovan positioned where I could watch him, I started checking the cab of the truck. The inside was neat, almost obsessively so. No fast food wrappers, no coffee cups, just a road atlas folded to show the route from Illinois to New York, and a small cooler with some sandwiches and water bottles. But when I leaned in to check under the driver's seat, my fingers brushed against something that made my pulse spike. Cold metal, the unmistakable shape of a gun barrel. I pulled out a Ruger .357 revolver, fully loaded, with 2 speed loaders tucked behind it in a leather holster that had been wedged deep under the seat. The serial number had been filed off, a federal crime on its own. My training kicked in immediately. I drew my service weapon, ordered Donovan to get on his knees with his hands interlocked behind his head, and called for that backup to hurry the hell up. His whole body seemed to deflate when he saw me holding the gun. He didn't resist, didn't say a word, just slowly lowered himself to the ground with this strange expression. Not quite defeat, not quite relief, but something in between. While keeping my weapon trained on him, I noticed other things in the truck that hadn't seemed important before. There was a police scanner under the dash, turned off but with fresh fingerprints in the dust around the controls. A manila envelope tucked between the seats contained multiple IDs, all with his photo but different names: Frank Donovan, Frederick Daniels, Francis Decker, each one from a different state, each one professionally made. This wasn't some small-time criminal. This was someone who'd been running for a long time. Backup arrived 12 minutes later, felt like 12 hours. 2 units came screaming in with lights blazing, and we got Donovan cuffed and secured in the back of one of the patrol cars. While one of the officers stood guard, I went back to the truck with better lighting to do a thorough search. In the glove compartment, wrapped in an oilcloth, I found something that made everyone stop what they were doing. A police badge from the Chicago Police Department, vintage 1970s, with dried blood still caked in the crevices around the badge number. There was also a yellowed newspaper clipping, carefully preserved in plastic, with the headline, "Officer Stanley Cop Shot Dead During Traffic Stop, Killer Still at Large." The date on the paper was from 1978, 39 years ago. I looked at the booking photo of the suspect they'd been hunting. Younger, clean-shaven, but unmistakably the same bone structure, the same deep-set eyes that had been watching me in that driver's side mirror. The story came together piece by piece over the next few hours at the station. Frank Donovan was actually Francis Donnelly, and he'd shot Officer Stanley Kopp during what should have been a routine traffic stop on a Chicago highway in 1978. Kopp had pulled him over for a broken taillight, not knowing Donnelly had just robbed a liquor store and shot the owner. When Kopp approached the vehicle, Donnelly shot him 3 times in the chest, took his badge as some sick trophy, and disappeared. For 39 years, he'd been living under assumed names, moving every few years, working cash jobs as a mechanic or handyman. He'd gotten comfortable, maybe even convinced himself that enough time had passed that nobody was looking anymore. The FBI had actually closed the active investigation in 2005, moving it to cold case status. Donnelly had been heading to Buffalo to cross into Canada. He'd been spooked by something, maybe a news story about new DNA technology solving old cases, maybe just paranoia finally catching up. He'd made it almost 4 decades without getting caught, and it all ended because my dog knew something was wrong. What really got to me, sitting in that interrogation room watching him through the one-way glass, was how ordinary he looked. This wasn't some movie villain with crazy eyes and facial scars. He was just a tired-looking old man who could have been anybody's grandfather, somebody you'd see buying groceries or getting coffee at the diner. But he'd stolen 40 years from Stanley Kopp, 40 years from Kopp's wife who died never knowing who killed her husband, 40 years from his 2 kids who grew up without a father. The detective interviewing him said Donnelly's first question wasn't about a lawyer or what would happen to him. He asked about Rex, wanted to know what kind of training the dog had, how he knew. The detective told him some dogs just know when something's wrong, that they can smell guilt and fear in ways humans can't understand. Donnelly just nodded and said the dog reminded him of one Kopp had in his cruiser that night, watching from the back seat as he shot its handler. The trial was swift, with the murder weapon, the stolen badge, and DNA evidence linking him to the crime scene from 1978. Donnelly pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He got life without parole, spent his first night in prison on what would have been Officer Kopp's 68th birthday. The Chicago Police Department flew me and Rex out for the sentencing, wanted to give Rex a commendation for closing their oldest unsolved Kopp killing. Standing in that courtroom, watching Kopp's grown children finally get closure, seeing retired officers who'd worked with Kopp and spent decades hunting his killer, it was overwhelming. Rex sat beside me, calm and professional like always, but I swear he knew what he'd done, knew how important that night on Route 31 had been. After the ceremony, Kopp's son, now a cop himself in Chicago, shook my hand and then knelt down to Rex, buried his face in the dog's fur, and just held him for a long moment. He told me his dad had loved working with K-9 units, that he'd been pushing for more K-9 officers in Chicago before he died. Felt like something coming full circle, like maybe Kopp himself had been watching out for us that foggy night. I still patrol that same stretch of road, still work the graveyard shift with Rex, though he's getting close to retirement now. Every time we pass that spot where I pulled Donnelly over, Rex perks up, nose working the air like he's checking to make sure everything's right. I've never had him react to anyone the way he did that night. That pure, instinctive recognition of danger that probably saved my life. If I'd approached that truck without knowing something was wrong, if Rex hadn't warned me, Donnelly might have added another dead cop to his count. He had nothing left to lose, and that gun was loaded and ready. The department therapist says I should focus on the positive outcome, on justice finally being served. But sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m. thinking about all the traffic stops Donnelly must have gone through in those 39 years. All the officers who pulled him over and let him go, never knowing they were inches away from a cop killer. I think about Rex, about that primal instinct that knew what human eyes couldn't see. They retired Kopp's badge number after he died, but somehow, on that November night, his spirit got its justice through the nose of a German Shepherd and a routine traffic stop that turned out to be anything but routine. "22 years on the force in downtown Houston, and I thought I'd seen everything. It was a Wednesday morning in early April when dispatch sent us to check out a smell complaint at the Grandview Towers on Westheimer. I was partnering with Officer Ruiz that day, a rookie who'd only been with us about 8 months. The building manager, Mrs. Chen Williams, met us in the lobby looking genuinely disturbed. She kept dabbing at her nose with a handkerchief, explaining how multiple residents from the 7th floor had been calling her office for the past 3 days. She'd tried knocking on apartment 7G herself, but nobody answered. The tenant, she told us, was a quiet guy named Christopher Lawton, who worked nights at a pharmaceutical warehouse and rarely caused any problems. The smell hit us the moment the elevator doors opened on the 7th floor. It wasn't the unmistakable stench of death that I'd unfortunately encountered before, but something else entirely. A mixture of human waste, rotting food, and something chemical that burned the inside of your nostrils. Mrs. Chen Williams had to stay back by the elevators while Ruiz and I approached 7G. We knocked hard, announced ourselves as police, waited. Nothing. Knocked again, louder this time. The neighbors from 7F and 7H had both cracked their doors open to watch, covering their faces with their shirts. After the third attempt with no response, Mrs. Chen Williams gave us permission to enter. She had brought the master key, but when she tried it, we discovered Lawton had installed an additional deadbolt that her key couldn't open. We had to call for backup and wait for someone to bring the breaching tools. During that wait, I remembered something that made my chest tighten. About 4 months earlier, maybe 5, we'd been called to this exact apartment for a noise complaint. I'd responded with Officer Martinez that time. The neighbor in 7H had called about what sounded like arguing and things being thrown around. When we'd knocked, Lawton had answered almost immediately, all apologetic smiles and nervous energy. He was a thin guy, maybe 35, with these watery blue eyes that never quite met yours directly. Said he'd been moving furniture and dropped his television. We'd accepted his explanation without pushing further. Standard procedure for a first-time domestic disturbance call with no signs of violence. God, how that memory would eat at me later. When the breaching tools arrived, it took us less than a minute to get through that deadbolt. The apartment inside was nothing like what we expected given the smell. The living room was immaculate, vacuum lines still visible on the carpet, coffee table gleaming with fresh polish, not a single item out of place. The kitchen was the same story, dishes neatly stacked, counters spotless, even fresh flowers in a vase by the window. Ruiz actually whistled low and muttered something about the place being cleaner than his own apartment. But that smell was stronger now, definitely coming from somewhere deeper inside. We moved through carefully, announcing ourselves again, checking the bathroom, pristine. The first bedroom, converted into a home office, perfectly organized, until we reached the hallway that led to what must have been the master bedroom. The door at the end of that hallway had a padlock on it. Not just any padlock either. This was a heavy-duty industrial-grade lock, the kind you'd see on storage units or construction sites. The wood around where it was installed looked reinforced with metal plates that had been painted over to match the door. Ruiz touched my arm and pointed to the bottom of the door. There was maybe a 2-inch gap there, and you could see towels had been stuffed underneath from the inside. Dark stains covered parts of the towels that were visible. The smell was overwhelming here, making my eyes water. We called out again, identified ourselves as police, said we were coming in. Then we heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it, like someone trying to speak through layers of cloth or maybe crying. It was human, definitely human, coming from behind that door. Ruiz ran back to get the bolt cutters while I stayed by the door, talking loudly, saying help was coming, asking if anyone could hear me. The muffled sounds continued, becoming more desperate, more insistent. My heart was hammering as Ruiz returned and we cut through that padlock. The door swung open and the smell hit us like a physical wall. The room was dark. Windows had been covered with blackout curtains nailed directly into the walls. In the corner, on a stained mattress on the floor, was a young woman. She was skeletal thin, her dark hair matted and grown past her waist, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Her ankles were secured with zip ties to a metal ring that had been bolted into the floor. When she saw us, she started making those sounds again, and that's when we realized her mouth was wired shut. Not crudely, but precisely, medically, like someone had done orthodontic work, but left the wires closed permanently. Ruiz immediately called for paramedics while I knelt beside her, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. Her eyes were wide, alert, tracking our every movement with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. I cut the zip ties with my knife while telling her she was safe now, that we were police, that medical help was coming. She immediately tried to claw at the wires in her mouth, making terrible choking sounds. I had to gently hold her hands, telling her the paramedics would handle it safely. That's when I noticed her fingers. Several fingernails were completely gone. The skin healed over, like they'd been removed months ago. On the nightstand beside the mattress was a collection of items that made everything clear. Bottles of liquid meal replacements, the kind used for patients with jaw surgery, protein powder, vitamins, and a detailed notebook. The notebook was filled with Christopher Lawton's neat handwriting, feeding schedules, bathroom schedules, weight measurements, all dated meticulously going back 7 months. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. While they worked on stabilizing her, I stepped out into the hallway where Mrs. Chen Williams was waiting with more officers who'd arrived as backup. She was shaking, kept asking what was happening. I asked her if Christopher Lawton had any family, any visitors she knew about. She said he'd mentioned a sister once, said she lived somewhere up north and they weren't close. That's when my partner Martinez showed up. He'd heard the call on the radio and recognized the address from our previous visit. His face went pale when I told him what we'd found. We both stood there thinking the same thing. We'd been 3 feet from her 4 months ago. She'd probably heard our voices, maybe tried to make noise, and we'd just accepted Lawton's explanation and left. The guilt hit like a sledgehammer. The next few hours were a blur of controlled chaos. The young woman was identified as Jennifer Lawton, 28 years old, reported missing from Minnesota 7 months earlier. She'd supposedly come to visit her brother after losing her job, according to the missing persons report her roommate had filed. Christopher Lawton was nowhere to be found. His car was gone from the parking garage, and his cell phone was turned off. We put out an APB immediately. While crime scene techs processed the apartment, we found more evidence that turned our stomachs. Hidden in the office closet were boxes of Jennifer's belongings: her purse, driver's license, phone, even her suitcase with clothes still neatly folded inside. There were also medical supplies, boxes of orthodontic wire, surgical tools, sedatives with prescription labels scratched off. Turned out Lawton worked at a medical supply warehouse, had access to everything he needed. In his computer, which our tech team cracked within an hour, were hundreds of photos of Jennifer from before. Normal photos from her social media, family gatherings, her college graduation. He'd been obsessing over her for years. At the hospital, once the oral surgeon had carefully removed the wires from Jennifer's mouth, a 2-hour procedure, she was finally able to tell her story in a hoarse, barely there whisper. She'd come to Houston thinking she was helping her brother through a rough patch after he'd called claiming he was suicidal. The first night, he'd drugged her tea. She woke up in that room, already restrained. He'd told her she was sick, that the outside world was dangerous, that he was protecting her. The wire procedure happened about a month in, after she'd screamed for help when maintenance was in the hallway. She could hear life going on outside. People in the hallway, TVs through the walls. Even us that night, we'd come about the noise complaint. She'd tried so hard to make sound, had thrown herself against the floor, but with the wires and the soundproofing he'd installed, nothing got through loud enough. The most horrifying detail? He would sit with her for hours, feeding her through a straw, brushing her hair, reading to her, acting like this was all perfectly normal, like they were just a close family taking care of each other. They caught Christopher Lawton 2 days later at a rest stop near the Mexican border. He'd been sleeping in his car, hadn't even tried to disguise himself. When they arrested him, he seemed genuinely confused, kept insisting he needed to get back to take care of his sister, that she couldn't manage without him. During interrogation, which I watched from behind the glass, he never showed a hint of understanding that what he'd done was wrong. He spoke about Jennifer like she was a beloved pet or a fragile possession that needed constant protection. He said their parents had died when they were teenagers, that he'd always looked after her, that she didn't understand how to take care of herself. The prosecutor said it was one of the clearest cases of delusional disorder she'd ever seen, combined with what the psychiatrist called pathological caregiving. He genuinely believed he was saving her from the world. The trial was swift. He got 25 to life. Jennifer testified via video link from Minnesota, where she'd returned to live with cousins. Her voice was stronger by then, though she said she still couldn't speak above a whisper without panic setting in. The case changed how our department handles welfare checks and noise complaints. Now, if we get called to an address more than once, we do a thorough walkthrough, check every room if the resident consents. If they don't consent, we document everything, take photos of whoever answers the door, file detailed reports that get reviewed by supervisors. I still think about that night 4 months before we found her. How Lawton's nervous energy and quick explanation had seemed so plausible. How Jennifer must have heard my voice through the walls and prayed we'd somehow know she was there. I ended up going to therapy myself after this case. The department mandated it, but I would have gone anyway. Some calls you can shake off after a shift. This one lives in my bones. Jennifer sent a letter to the department 6 months after the trial, thanking us for finding her, saying she was in therapy, reconnecting with old friends, even considering going back to school. She included a photo of herself at a park somewhere, looking healthy, smiling. We pinned it up in the break room. Every rookie who comes through sees it, hears the story. We tell them, never assume, always verify and trust that feeling when something seems too clean, too perfect, too quickly explained away. Because sometimes the real horror is hiding right behind the door you didn't think to open. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavier than usual, the kind where even silence carried weight. I was working the late patrol with my partner, Officer Markham, when dispatch radioed about a car left running in a supermarket parking lot on the edge of town. Headlights on, driver's side door wide open. Calls like that weren't uncommon, usually someone too tired or distracted, but something about the urgency in the dispatcher's tone made me uneasy before we even pulled in. The lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered vehicles pushed to the far end. The supermarket had closed hours earlier, leaving only the humming of the lights above the entrance and the distant buzz of an old neon pharmacy sign flickering nearby. The car in question sat closer to the loading area than the main entrance. A late-model sedan, engine humming steady, headlights casting harsh beams across the asphalt. The door hung wide like someone had stepped out mid-thought and never returned. We approached slowly, scanning the surroundings. The first detail that caught my attention was a grocery bag tossed on the passenger seat. Inside were half-melted ice cream containers, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk sweating condensation. Whoever left had intended to be gone for only minutes. The keys were still in the ignition, and the dashboard air freshener swung gently as if stirred by someone's recent movement. It was eerie, standing there with the engine running, no driver in sight, as if the night itself had swallowed them whole. Markham ran the plates while I circled the car, flashlight beam grazing the ground. That's when dispatch came back with the hit. The car belonged to a man named Eric Dalton, reported missing just 24 hours earlier by his sister. The last anyone had seen him, he'd left her house after dinner to pick up groceries. Now here was his car, groceries untouched, door open, keys still in place, and not a sign of him anywhere. The first sweep of the area didn't reveal much at first. The lot stretched wide, with cracked pavement and patches of weeds pushing up between faded paint lines. About 20 feet from the car, though, I noticed faint scuff marks on the ground, drag patterns in the dirt mixed with dark stains that glistened under the flashlight. They led toward a line of overgrown hedges bordering the far end of the lot. It wasn't the kind of place someone would willingly wander into, not with thorny branches tangled together so tightly. My chest tightened at the thought of someone being pulled through there against their will. Markham called for backup while I crouched near the marks. Up close, it was worse. One of Eric's sneakers sat wedged halfway under a hedge, the laces torn and frayed. A few receipts from the grocery store were crumpled nearby, one smeared with something that looked a lot like blood. The way the items were scattered didn't feel accidental. It looked like the aftermath of someone struggling desperately not to be taken. The supermarket's cameras pointed mostly toward the entrance, not the side lot where the car had been parked, which meant there'd be no easy answers on video. Within 20 minutes, more officers arrived. their cruisers lighting the entire lot in red and blue flashes. The silence that had blanketed the place earlier was replaced by the chatter of radios, heavy boots crunching on gravel, and the rustle of branches as we pushed deeper into the hedge line. We found broken branches, more smeared stains, and a torn piece of a jacket sleeve caught on a branch. Every new detail painted the same picture. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been quick or clean. Eric hadn't just stepped out of his car and wandered off. He'd been taken, and he'd fought hard. The most disturbing discovery came when one of the officers spotted deep impressions in the dirt just beyond the hedge. They were too wide to be simple footprints. It looked like someone had set down a heavy container or dragged something bulky across the ground. The trail veered off toward the back access road behind the supermarket, a narrow lane used by delivery trucks. By then, my gut was telling me we were standing in the middle of the exact spot where Eric had disappeared, in plain view of anyone who might have driven by, yet no one had seen a thing. That detail unsettled me more than anything else. We followed the trail until it disappeared near the loading dock. The asphalt there was scraped as if a vehicle had braked hard before pulling away. No cameras covered that corner either, just a broken light fixture that hadn't worked in years. It struck me how deliberate it all seemed, like whoever planned this knew exactly where the blind spots were. The idea that someone had staged an abduction right under our noses, in such a public place, gnawed at me. People always assume danger hides in shadows, but that night it stood boldly under buzzing lamps in a supermarket lot. Detectives were called in, and the entire scene was locked down. For hours we combed through every inch of the surrounding area. We knocked on doors of the few houses across the street, asked drivers who'd passed by earlier, even spoke to a night shift janitor at the pharmacy next door. Not a single person reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. That silence was louder than any scream. It was as if the world had chosen to look away the very moment Eric was dragged from his car. The evidence was collected, the items bagged, the stains swabbed, but none of it brought us closer to finding him that night. When I finally got back into my cruiser, I stared at the empty space where his sedan had been parked, the faint outline of its tires still marked on the pavement. The image has stayed with me ever since. A man vanished, groceries melting in the seat, door left open to the night. We don't often talk about it anymore, but for me, that parking lot still carries a weight every time I drive past it. In the weeks that followed, tips came and went, most of them useless. To this day, Eric Dalton has never been found. What unsettles me the most isn't just his disappearance, it's the way it happened. Public, brazen, efficient. Someone had the audacity to take him right there in front of anyone who might have walked by, and no one saw a thing. That truth still keeps me awake at night. Not knowing who was behind it, not knowing where he ended up, and realizing that sometimes the scariest dangers are the ones that don't bother to hide. My shifts at the call center always blurred together. Endless rings and routine emergencies that I could almost handle on autopilot. At that point in my life, I worked nights while trying to balance raising my younger brother, who lived with me after our parents passed. Sleep came in fragments, meals were cold leftovers, and most nights were a mix of domestic disputes, false alarms, and the occasional accident. Nothing prepared me for the one call that still echoes in my head years later. It didn't come with screaming or chaos like most, just silence that carried weight. When the line opened, I heard faint breathing, slow and shallow, like someone trying to control it. At first I thought it was a kid playing with the phone, but there was no giggling, no background chatter. Just muffled rustling as if fabric was brushing against the microphone. I repeated the usual questions. 911, what's your emergency? Can you hear me? But whoever it was never answered. That silence felt heavier the longer it stretched, like the caller wanted me to stay on but couldn't risk speaking. Protocol kicked in. We traced the call, and it pinged to a suburban neighborhood not far from the edge of town. The house was listed to a woman named Claire Jensen, 33, single mother of one. While I kept the line open, the officers were dispatched. I listened harder, straining through the static and faint noises. At one point, I thought I caught what sounded like a child's toy being moved. That squeaky plastic wheel kind of sound, but it was so quick it could have been interference. My palms left damp prints on the desk, but I kept my voice steady, repeating questions into the void. The officers radioed in as they approached. They said the front door was slightly ajar, no signs of forced entry, no barking dog, no immediate sense of danger outside. I still had the call connected, the breathing softer now, almost like it was further from the phone. Upstairs, the team reported a bedroom with a bed that looked like someone had just rolled out of it, blankets pulled halfway to the floor. On the carpet near the nightstand lay a phone, still lit up, still connected to me. The moment they confirmed that detail, the line finally went dead. The silence that followed was worse than the breathing. I remember staring at the dead line on my screen, feeling this strange mix of dread and curiosity. The officers swept the rest of the house and reported no one inside. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no struggle. A purse sat neatly on the kitchen counter, keys inside. A glass of water half full by the sink. It looked like someone had stepped out for just a moment, but the phone upstairs told a different story. I stayed on the headset while the sergeant gave me updates. They checked the child's room, small bed with bright sheets, a few dolls lined neatly against the wall, but no child. Neighbors were questioned. Most hadn't seen Claire since earlier that morning. One mentioned a delivery truck idling outside for longer than usual, but couldn't recall the company name. Another swore she heard the faint sound of someone calling out around the time the call came through, but brushed it off as TV noise. Each detail felt like a breadcrumb leading nowhere. What unsettled me most was how ordinary everything seemed. The officers found her wallet still in her purse, ID inside, credit cards untouched. No suitcase missing, no overnight bag gone. If she had planned to leave, she hadn't prepared. The bed upstairs looked like she had been resting, maybe reading before sleep. The sheets were warm, they said, as if she had just gotten up. But nobody could explain how the phone ended up on the floor, still connected to me, or who was breathing on the line. Hours stretched while the investigation unfolded. The child was located later with a babysitter a few blocks away, safe but confused, saying Claire had promised to be back before bedtime. That left only one conclusion. Whatever happened inside that house happened fast. I sat there at my console, replaying the sound of that breathing in my mind, the faint toy wheel, the rustle. Even now, I wonder if she was trying to signal me somehow, stuck in a situation where she couldn't speak. And the worst part? We never found her. The official report listed her as missing, but to me, it never felt like a simple disappearance. I remember replaying the audio from that call later during review, every crackle and breath amplified through the headset. You could hear the faint creak of what might have been floorboards, then nothing for long stretches, like the caller was hiding. That call lasted exactly 11 minutes and 32 seconds. 11 minutes of someone trying to reach help without daring to speak, until silence swallowed the line. Detectives worked the case for months, chasing leads that fizzled out. They canvassed the neighborhood, pulled traffic camera footage, even tracked down local delivery companies. No truck matched the neighbor's description. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no evidence of a break-in. It was as if Claire simply stepped out of her own life mid-sentence. Her family came by the center once begging for details, and I didn't know what to say except that I heard her breathing. That was all I had. For a long time, I couldn't sleep properly. Every time the phone rang at work, I expected to hear that same muffled breath. I'd sit straighter in my chair, headset pressing into my ear, waiting for the sound of someone trapped on the other end. A few prank calls came through after the case made the news, people mocking the ghost caller. But none of them matched the weight of that original silence. That call wasn't a prank. You could feel the presence of someone terrified, trying to stay alive. The strangest detail is what happened weeks later. An officer went back to Claire's house with her sister to collect belongings. On the nightstand in that same upstairs bedroom, they found the phone charger coiled neatly, plugged in as if someone had been there after the search. The sister swore it wasn't her. To this day, no one knows how it got there. Claire never turned up. That single call remains the most haunting moment of my career, and every time my console lights up, I still half expect to hear that same faint breathing waiting for me on the other end.